Welcome to Convocations. Today we have two speakers that will be talking to us. The first is Rebecca Wiederhold, who works in the Archives and Manuscripts division in BYU's library. She participates in the management of library systems that serve campus students and faculty. Her research has included the evaluation of library processes, organizational structures, and systems in the pursuit of improved library services for campus stakeholders. Other research interests include archival description and cataloging practices, historical records, 19th and 20th century Utah and Latter-day Saint history, and she currently serves as the Society of American Archivists representative on the Library of Congress's MARC Advisory Committee. And Rebecca holds a Master's of Library Science degree and 2 graduate certificates from the University of North Texas, and is a current member of the Academy of Certified Archivists. Our second speaker is Michael Austin, who is the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Snow College. He is the co-founder of By Common Consent Press and the author of 9 books. So, right, get your reading in. Including the best-selling textbook, Reading the World, Ideas That Matter, and award-winning books such as Rereading Job, Buried Treasures, and Vardis Fisher, a Mormon novelist. His most recent book is The Testimony of Two Nations, How the Book of Mormon Reads and Rereads the Bible, which was published by the University of Illinois Press last year, and he lives here in Ephraim with his wife, Karen. Their speech today is going to be called the LDS Church Academy's Curriculum from 1875 to 1900. And so let's give a round of applause for Rebecca and Mike.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am excited to be here today and talk to you about one of my favorite research topics. As a quick introduction, I'm an archivist in my day-to-day work at the library. It involves arrangement and description of archival collections. So I work with historic photographs, diaries, institutional records, and all sorts of quote-unquote old stuff. I am a faculty member at BYU, but I'm not a professor. But I do get to do research and publication as part of my job. This topic of the early education efforts within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is probably my favorite research area right now. Dr. Austin and I are working together on research about the church academies, which were high schools operated by the LDS Church between 1875 and the mid-1920s. Michael's going to be talking today about San Pete Stake Academy, which was the precursor to Snow College. We thought that'd be of particular interest to you as students here. Before he gets into that, I'm going to give a brief introduction of the educational landscape in early Utah and an overview of the church academies in general. Education was an early priority for Latter-day Saints pioneers as they came into Salt Lake and began building communities throughout the area. Secular public schools were not a common component of United States society yet. So the predominantly Latter-day Saint populations formed both public and private schools, which intermingled religious and secular teachings and were funded by tuition and local taxes. The school on this slide is the Brigham Young Schoolhouse, a private school built in 1860 specifically for the tutoring of his many children. Most schoolhouses were humble at first, with classes sometimes taking place in tents or log rooms. Some were held in the local congregation or ward building, but communities usually did prioritize the building of a schoolhouse, however modest. Most schools only taught primary grades. The necessities of farm life and the impact of illness and other hardships often interrupted school schedules. Schools also had a hard time keeping teachers due to poor conditions and low pay. High schools were scarce, and there was limited opportunity for higher education for training new teachers. Without a university where teachers could be trained and prepared to teach subjects beyond elementary school, the first efforts to begin providing more advanced education to high school age students began as private schools. In 1860, Utah Territory Governor and President of the LDS Church, Brigham Young, decided to establish a free public high school in Salt Lake City. Union Academy was opened that year with an initial infusion of $2,500 from the church, offering high school courses for free and initially only catering to male students. Although a girls' school was initially planned, it never came to fruition, and classes at that academy soon included students of both genders. Ongoing church support of the school did not continue, so the school relied on tuition. This academy eventually merged with another school and became part of the University of Utah. As a side note, in the texts that have been written about the LDS academies, the first church-sponsored high schools is generally agreed to have been Brigham Young Academy, which was established in Provo in 1875. However, the centennial history of BYU acknowledges that the mostly forgotten and short-lived Union Academy was the model that Brigham Young Academy was later patterned after. An early figure that made a significant impact on the direction of education efforts in the LDS Church was Carl G. Mazer. He was a convert from Germany who'd been well educated before immigrating to Utah in 1860. Having worked as a professor in his home country, he continued in the profession when he joined the Latter-day Saints in Utah. Mazer was involved in several private schools, including acting as tutor to Brigham Young's children, and he also taught German at the University of Deseret. Mazer became a trusted educational expert in the church, and his philosophies and methodologies were instrumental in the development of not only the secondary education offered at the academies, but also primary grades, collegiate courses, and a program for teacher training. Mazer was asked by Brigham Young to move to Provo to take over as principal of the Brigham Young Academy shortly after it was established in 1875. Mazer was initially overwhelmed by the enormity of the task that had been laid on his shoulders, but he was passionate about designing a program that would develop strong future church and community leaders. He felt he was divinely inspired in this effort. Mazer's vision included several unique components. First, not only were theology courses offered, but all secular subjects were meant to be taught with the Holy Spirit. Second, everything that could be done by the students in the governance of the school should be given to them to do. Third, both male and female students were allowed to fully participate. And fourth, the use of corporeal punishment for discipline was shunned in favor of loving guidance. Brigham Young Academy weathered numerous financial and logistical challenges over its first decade, but eventually became a model institution after which other church high schools would be patterned. In their first few decades in Utah, public schools were primarily populated by Latter-day Saints, but by the late 1860s, significant populations not affiliated with the church began to move to Utah, including silver miners, entrepreneurs and businessmen, and of course members of other religious faiths, some of whom sought to save Latter-day Saint children from Mormonism. This new religious and social diversity within Utah communities caused conflict when it came to the curriculum of the public schools. Private Protestant schools also began to be more prevalent. School teachers were relatively scarce, causing some ward schools to resort to hiring teachers that were not members of the church. These societal changes caused concern among church leaders. During the period of time before Utah gained statehood, ongoing clashes between the church and the federal government over issues related to the territory's theocratic government and the practice of polygamy also greatly impacted public education. The Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 was a major flashpoint because it removed local control of public schools within Utah's territorial districts and introduced a prohibition of the use of religious books in public schools. This law was a major factor spurring the church to further develop their own schools throughout the territory. On June 8, 1888, the church established a general board of education that consisted of high-level church leaders and several prominent educators within the church. The primary function of this centralized board of education was to supervise the church academies, or secondary schools, that were to be established in each of the church's stakes. A stake is a church administrative unit made up of multiple local congregations or wards that surround a geographic area. The board sent a circular to the presidents of all the church's stakes expressing their conviction that secular and spiritual education should be intertwined and that church-run education would need to be expanded. The letter read in part, "We feel that the time has arrived when the proper education of our children should be taken in hand by us as a people. Religious training is practically excluded from the district schools. To permit this condition of things to exist among us would be criminal. We should have schools where the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants can be used as textbooks. The various stakes of the church were each asked to form their own board of education and establish an academy within their stake boundaries. The little colored squares on this map mark the locations of these academies. 26 stakes had established an academy within 3 years of the church's direction to do so, which accounted for all but 2 of the existing stakes at the time. Over the next 2 decades, 6 more academies were founded, including 2 international schools, one in Alberta and one in Mexico. A principal was appointed to direct each school, and they had responsibility for hiring teachers, overseeing fundraising efforts to plan for the construction of the schools, and oversight for curriculum and social activities. Academies relied on the support of the teachers, students, and patrons of the school in order to ensure their schools had adequate meeting space, furniture, textbooks, and other necessary materials. The buildings themselves took years and sometimes decades before sufficient fundraising allowed for construction to begin, although the church did provide some portion of their funding. In the meantime, the academy classes often met in the local co-op or other buildings around town with sufficient space for school activities. The custodial work was done by students and faculty. On the slide here, you see a picture of San Pete Stake Academy, which again was the precursor to Snow College. I wanted to share a local example of how the community members played a role in the establishment and maintenance of their schools. This academy building wasn't finished until 1908, but close to 3/4 of the construction cost came from local donations of money and labor, and the remainder was paid for by the church. More students attended San Pete Stake Academy in its opening year than the stake and academy leaders expected, so there was a shortage of materials in the school for the students to use. To address this issue, in the circular for the 1889 to 1890 school year, an appeal was made for community members to help in establishing a library and cabinet for the San Pete Stake Academy. But that call for donations was only seen by a limited number of people, so they received only minimal donations. The stake presidency then consulted about the problem with Alma Greenwood, who was the principal of the academy, and they came up with a solution. They determined to jointly issue specialized mission calls to 24 men living in Ephraim and the surrounding towns. These academy missionaries took the assignment to heart, especially over the winter holiday. They proceeded to solicit donations of books, cash, and, quote, fossiliferous specimens, and the amounts of each that were donated were reported in the local newspaper, the Manti Home Sentinel. Their efforts were greatly appreciated by the school, and I do have to say that I am super interested to know if Snow College has retained any of these donated items, especially the fossiliferous specimens. It'd be neat to look at what the minerals or fossils from the local area they were examining in their natural history classes in 1890. The new academies were instructed that they should offer the same curriculum as Brigham Young Academy in Provo. A circular distributed to stake members explained the ambitious goal, quote, "We believe that all the branches of learning, all that which is true, embraced in science, in art, and in the professions, should be communicated to our offspring through inspired writings and teachers. It is our duty to surround our children with that influence which will inspire correct thought, pure and virtuous impressions and impulses." High school courses included various subjects within the math and science realms: reading, grammar, rhetoric, and elocution, philosophy, history, and choir. Some offered various language classes and classes in other subjects depending on the needs and opportunities of the particular community. Most academies offered preparatory courses for students not yet ready to enroll in the more rigorous high school classes, particularly if they had not previously received much schooling. Theology classes were mandatory for all students, and these were held daily. They taught church doctrines using the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants as scriptural textbooks. Students also learned about the history of the church in this class. Priesthood meetings were held weekly and were conducted by the students with alternating assignments to preside, take minutes, give reports, and teach about various aspects of the priesthood and other theological topics. The academy president also provided instruction in these meetings. Missionary meetings, or testimony meetings, were also held weekly, giving students the opportunity to take turns voluntarily expressing testimonies of the gospel. These meetings often began with a student or faculty member teaching about the sacrament ordinance or other gospel topics, after which the bread and water would be blessed and distributed. Any letters received from stake members serving missions would also be read to the congregation in the meeting. Over the years, various educational, cultural, and extracurricular activities took place at the academies outside the classroom. Most of the academies occasionally invited special speakers to give lectures, such as when a general authority from church headquarters was in town. Musical concerts were often held, especially at the more urban academies. Weber Academy added a special evening course in dancing and ballroom comportment for a season in 1912. Juarez Academy in Mexico put on annual musicals. Some of the academies formed school bands, orchestras, and especially choirs. Baseball, basketball, and other sports teams formed, and some of the schools put out newspapers or had social clubs. The development of public or district schools continued to change the landscape of education in the territory. Pictured here are many of the public schools that were built in Salt Lake and surrounding areas during the height of the LDS Academies era. The development of standard curriculum in the public schools was watched by the church, and efforts were made to keep similar academic standards so that students would not be disadvantaged should they pursue higher education after completing their program at the academy. So what happened to the LDS academies? Free public schools that were supported by taxes had been growing in popularity. By 1910, enrollment trends at the church-sponsored high schools had decreased nearly proportionally to the growth of the state-run public schools. With so many LDS students attending public schools, the church explored offering theological education in the form of seminary classes as a supplement to the secular schools, beginning in 1912. It also began to be apparent that the church's costs of running the academies would not be sustainable as the LDS population continued to grow. A few of the academies had offered both high school and college courses. In 1920, the Church Commission of Education decided to turn over to the state most of the academies that only offered high school courses. A notable exception was Juarez Academy, located in Mexico, which operates as a church-sponsored high school still to this day. Brigham Young University was the church's designated four-year educational institution. For a decade or so, remaining academies evolved into junior colleges meant to be feeder schools, as the church focused on training Latter-day Saint high school teachers that could then be hired to teach in the public schools. Eventually, the church transferred several of these institutions to the state, and over nearly a century since that time, they've developed unique specializations and missions, but they all share an interesting past, in my opinion. So I know that hearing about how people lived over 100 years ago sometimes might make it seem like they're from a foreign world. Even people from our own country and our own state, they had such different technologies than we have. Their food, their slang words, and their pastimes were different. They had different expectations and different life experiences. I found when I'm learning about the past, the more I can find out about how people lived, what they cared about, and why they did what they did, it makes these people seem so much more like myself and my friends and my community. That's why I'm including this image in my closing comments today. It's a photograph of BYU students taken in 1919. Ironically, I came across this particular photograph while I was cataloging the last couple of books on my desk on the very day that Utah's governor issued the stay home, stay safe order due to COVID-19. I had to retreat to my house and attempt to work from home while homeschooling my kids for the next few months. I'm sure most of you have acute memories of the many ways that COVID disrupted your middle school or high school experience, so maybe you can relate to the photograph. In some ways, these students had similar experiences to you. I'm sure most of you know that the Spanish flu was an epidemic that broke out near the end of World War I. It hit especially hard, infecting close to 1/3 of the world's population. As you see, these students were also wearing masks in public, trying to salvage their education and their social lives. In the 1919 yearbook, they memorialized the week that the flu hit Provo. School was canceled, and they all started to get lonesome, eventually heading home to be with their families. And like many of us, they struggled, they persevered, and they kept their sense of humor, as you see here in another Academy yearbook from 1919. They overcame their worldwide pandemic just as we have grown and learned from ours. Anyway, I hope this talk has given you a good backdrop for Utah's educational landscape in the late 19th and early 20th century. and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Becca. Does this work? Can you hear me? How do I make this work? Correct. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much, Becca. And this has been just a fascinating research project as we've gone in and looked at how the LDS Church educated people in Utah in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Did everybody get one of these when you came in? This is a facsimile of the very first Snow College, except that time it was the San Pete Stake Academy College catalog. So this was the entire catalog for the first year, 1888, starting in November. And this was all of the information that the students had. And we're going to go over some of this information. But I want to talk a little bit about what education looked like in San Pete County before and after the establishment of the San Pete Stake Academy, which met here in the co-op building on the second floor, which was called the Relief Society Hall, until the completion of the Noyes Building in 1908. So this is what territorial education in Utah looked like before statehood. In 1888, most primary schools, and this is grades 1 through 6, were called ward schools. They were run by individual LDS wards. The bishop was responsible for making space in the meeting house or providing a meeting house, and also for finding a teacher and supporting that teacher. And this was how the majority of elementary school education happened in Utah. There was a second option in the 1880s, and these were the Protestant and Catholic mission schools. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but large number of Protestant and Catholic organizations sent missionaries to Utah specifically to teach LDS children. And in the process, they hoped to convert them away from Mormonism, which was still practicing plural marriage at the time and was seen as problematic by many of the Protestant faithful. So there were a pretty large contingent of these Protestant day schools. Academies were junior high schools and high schools. The preparatory academy was what we would call grades 7 through 9. The intermediate academy were grades 10 through 12. Then there were normal schools. And a normal school was how teachers were educated, normed, they called it, how they became normed to certain standards of education. And so the normal schools prepared teachers. These were the equivalent of a junior college. These were 13th and 14th grades. And then there were a few colleges by 1888, the University of Deseret in 1850, Brigham Young Academy, which this says 1874, but it's really 1875. That was a typo. Westminster College, which was started by the Presbyterian Church, also in 1875, Utah Agricultural College, and then, as Becca mentioned, a number of the academies offered high school and college courses. So there was a high school program or an academy program, then there was a college program or an advanced program. And those academies that offered those college courses are the ones that became colleges that now are still some of the most important colleges in the state. So let's talk a little bit about these Protestant mission schools because they're part of our story. And I want to talk about San Pete Stake Academy, but a lot of the dynamics here were repeated across Utah. This is a little brief snippet from the Utah Commission report. The Utah Commission was established by Congress in 1882. It gave its report in 1884. And it talks about the problems still with the Mormons who aren't giving up polygamy. However, there is some hope for the next generation because there are 70 denominational schools now in Utah. This is 1884. Many of whom are the children of Mormon parents, the students. These schools are distributed as follows: Episcopal 5, Methodist 10, Congregational 26, Presbyterian 35, Baptist 2, and Catholic 1. So the largest bulk of these programs were from the Presbyterian Church USA, which had created a Utah mission, not just for schools, to come and civilize the Mormons. That was their objective, was to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to Utah. And they believed, and they were very open about this, that if they provided a high quality education to children, that would then influence the parents in their favor. They didn't proselytize in their courses, but they had hundreds of missionaries, very well-trained teachers with bachelor's and master's degrees, who out of their sense of Christian charity came to Utah for a couple of years in order to teach in the schools. And even by 1881, this produced an interesting controversy in San Pete County, which I want to go over very briefly because it had a pretty direct impact on the founding of the San Pete Stake Academy. In 1881, Harper's Magazine, which was the largest circulation magazine in the United States at the time, probably about 5 million readers, ran a story by the editor of the Salt Lake Tribune, C.C. Goodwin, and he said, and I'm going to quote it here, "A young Presbyterian minister came to Utah a few years ago to try to regain his lost health. He went to San Pete Valley where there were no schools, where there were boys and girls nearly grown to manhood and womanhood who were totally ignorant of the rudiments of education, and he opened a school." So this was a huge national libel of San Pete County, and the residents responded furiously with a series of affidavits in the Deseret News in December. This is on Christmas Eve, so December 24th. That says 1831. That's ridiculous. That should be 1881. That was another typo. I really ought to be ashamed of myself. But because of this, we have better records in San Pete County than almost anywhere else of how many students attended the rural school districts, because they wrote affidavits, notarized affidavits to the editor saying in the year 1867, there were 1,130 pupils enrolled in the San Pete County schools with an average daily attendance of 794, while in 1877 the number of pupils enrolled was 1,860 with an average daily attendance of 1,312. So I don't bring this up because it was true that there were no schools in San Pete County. I bring it up because this controversy has told us exactly what kind of schools there were in San Pete County. Most of the cities or villages had a school associated with the LDS ward. In Ephraim, there were 4 wards and there were 4 schools. Now, those wards were different languages. One was Norwegian and one was Danish. There was no Swedish ward. That actually caused a Swedish apostasy in the 1860s, but that's a completely different story. But what they're talking about, what the school they're talking about is still here in Mount Pleasant. How many of you have been to Wasatch Academy? That is the only part of the Presbyterian mission to Utah, other than Westminster College, that is still active. It was probably the most successful of all of the Presbyterian day schools because the Reverend Duncan McMillan was a very, very tireless researcher. Recruiter. So he came to San Pete County, and he did that because he had probably tuberculosis. He started a school, he built a building, he started the elementary academy, or the elementary school, and then in 1887, the Wasatch Academy graduated its first high school class. And here's kind of the situation that the people of San Pete County found themselves in. Wasatch Academy met in a new modern building whereas the San Pete Ward schools met in homes, ward buildings, and small schoolhouses, mainly without floors, dirt floor buildings. Wasatch Academy courses were taught by college graduates brought in from the East as part of a Christian mission, and they were paid, well paid, by outside donations of good Presbyterians everywhere who wanted to help save the Mormons. The ward schools were taught by Latter-day Saints. Teachers were usually paid in kind. If at all, they would give them some vegetables or maybe a hunk of beef, but they weren't paid in hard currency because there was very little. The Wasatch Academy used modern textbooks. The ward schools mainly used the Book of Mormon and the Bible as textbooks and used those to teach whatever that they were teaching. Wasatch Academy operated a predictable schedule with required attendance. The ward schools operated an unpredictable schedule. Sometimes they'd just close down for a month because they didn't have a teacher. So what do you think happened in San Pete County when this was the difference in the school districts, or the schools that were available? Many, many Latter-day Saint parents sent their children to the Presbyterian school. Not because they weren't good Latter-day Saints, but because the education was simply better in very, very obvious ways, and they wanted the best for their children, as parents always do. So this, by 1887, when the Wasatch Academy started their high school courses, and they weren't just the day school anymore, Ephraim and San Pete County had a problem, and this was very instrumental. This is one of the reasons why San Pete had one of the very first of the academies. The first group of academies under the new church education system, San Pete was one of the first 3 academies because they were under a lot of pressure from Presbyterians, and that can be rough. So the San Pete Stake Academy was first projected, or the funding and the site was first secured by the stake president, Canute Peterson, in March of 1883. And this was the co-op building, and that's, like many, many of the academies, the meetings until the building was built occurred in the local co-op building. In February of 1888, San Pete Stake Academy was authorized, and on November 5th, 1888, San Pete, and this is a lie, I'm telling you a lie here, actually it started with 121 students. However, by the end of the semester, there were 141 students. And this confused me for the longest time because there were just 2 numbers given frequently. Well, as it turns out, they started school, but they kept enrolling students all the way until the end. So I guess they had makeup work, but they by the end of the semester, they had 141 students in 2 sections, the preparatory section and the advanced section, and students tested into those. So they came here, they enrolled, they took a test, and then they tested into one or the other. And this was not the first high school experience in San Pete County, it was the second. Came 1 year after Wasatch Academy started its own high school and put a lot of pressure on the LDS stake to get their academy finished. So just a few interesting facts from year 1 that I want to talk about, and then we'll open up for questions. The very first year of operation, there were 8 board members and only 2 faculty members. So there was a 4-to-1 administration to faculty ratio. Many faculty will tell you that that's remained consistent. I don't think so, but so it was a very boss-heavy environment, and you had 2 teachers. One taught the intermediate department, and one taught preparatory department and the ladies' work department. At this time, in most of the academies, ladies' work was something you could major in. These are courses that you could take. They included what you would call now family and consumer sciences, what used to be called home ec, but these were classes in cooking and dressmaking and playing the pianoforte and lots of different things that were seen at the time as what women should be studying in college. But it was completely coeducational, and those were just some classes. The male and female students took largely the same curriculum. Tuition during the first year was $6 for the intermediate and $4 for the preparatory course. And if you work that out with inflation, that's $130 for the junior high school and $196, almost $200 a semester for the high school in today's money. And that was actually a pretty significant chunk of money for people at the time, because there was largely a barter economy in San Pete County at the time. Hard currency was hard to come by, so this was a stretch for people. But it does seem very low to us today when tuition is substantially higher. So these are the subjects that were offered at San Pete County during the very first semester. And I want you to notice how many of them are all language-based. So theology, reading, grammar, composition, orthography, which is spelling, arithmetic, geography, elocution, which is kind of like public speaking, but it was a lot more how to actually form the words in your mouth. They would go over exercises to make sure that you said the rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain. And then penmanship. And then singing and hygiene were sort of the extracurriculars. Notice that 6 of these original categories are some form of reading or writing or speaking. So you would study grammar and composition and spelling and handwriting. So Snow College has always had that bent, what we would call the liberal arts bent. It began teaching really arithmetic, geography, and 6 different ways of putting words together to make sense. This was a very, very typical career. I had hoped to have some of these textbooks here, which I bought on eBay, but they haven't been delivered yet. But these textbooks were the textbooks that were used in comparable institutions across the country. So this was a very standard 19th century American curriculum, except for the theology classes, which were very LDS intensive and did focus on the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Bible. Otherwise, this was about the same education you would have gotten in New York or Boston, with the same books, possibly not with the same qualification of teachers at the very beginning, though that got much better. Some of the rules, you could not use profanity or obscenity, or you would be expelled. Could not use tobacco or strong drink. And if you wanted to attend any party, you had to have a note from the principal. Yeah. And that wasn't substantially different than other schools either. You would have found that in a lot of schools where students going to parties was prohibited. Remember, these are 7th graders. So these are very young students. Now, here are some milestones because the San Pete Stake Academy started off with 2 faculty members, but it grew very, very quickly. And I want to kind of talk about when some things happened that were relevant and still are relevant, I think, to Snow College. From the very beginning, we had a music program. Music classes were offered on day 1. So you're here in our music concert hall, but the music program at Snow College is one of its oldest things. 1 year later, in 1889, they offered their first art classes. Also in 1889, so only 1 year after starting the high school, San Pete State added 13th and 14th grades and created a normal school. And that was so that they would have teachers to teach in the future, both at San Pete State Academy and in the ward schools, the elementary schools. But that also means that San Pete got into the college level because normal schools were a college function. So the San Pete State Academy got into the college game very, very quickly. This is why there is still a Snow College. Most academies never got into the college courses, but San Pete very quickly moved to offer college courses. And then in 1892, 1 year after that, they offered college-level degrees now these would have been, as Snow is now, these would have been 2-year degrees, or what they at that time called junior college degrees. But they offered college degrees in business, bookkeeping, and commercial arithmetic. Then in 1892, something really interesting happens, and that is that Latin, which was taught in 1891, they began teaching Latin, and that was pretty standard at colleges. The university that I just came from, the University of Evansville, up until the 1920s, you had to give a speech in Latin in order to graduate. But they dropped Latin and they picked up Spanish, and they actually put a note in the catalog as to why, because nobody taught Spanish in 1892 or 1893. It just wasn't a common language to be taught in colleges in the United States. But this was something that was printed in the catalog. In regard to the value of this study, the LDS College says, and that would have been James Talmage, was the president of the LDS College at the time, the importance of the Spanish tongue cannot be overestimated. It is the means by which our elders will communicate with millions of inhabitants of Mexico and Central and South America. Our close proximity to these Spanish-speaking people to whom the gospel must be carried renders the study of this language paramount to that of any other. Ollendorf's new method by M. Velasquez will be used as a textbook. So Snow College, Santa Fe Stake Academy, from very, very early on was teaching Spanish because that was seen as important to the missionary work. And then by 1897, San Pete Stake Academy offered courses in carpentry and blacksmithing, and what you see now at Snow, with a solid liberal arts background, with music and art being very important, with language and those academic subjects being emphasized, but also with programs in the trades that are preparing people for a career. This was all in place at the college level by 1897, which I think is really remarkable. So that's kind of where we're going to end and open ourselves for questions.
All right, we should have a couple people with microphones. We have about 5 minutes, so that would be enough, probably three questions. So I know you guys have had some time to think about those, right? So.
So where did your idea to start researching these academies come from?
So when I was hired to be the provost at Snow College last year, at that time I had just finished a research project on the literature curriculum in the early Mutual Improvement Association and the Relief Society. And I thought, I'm coming to Snow College, I want to start researching it. I am a researcher, I do the research into the history of curriculum and other ideas. So I just decided I wanted to look at some of the academies, and I mentioned this to a very good friend of mine who works at the BYU Library, and she said, I have a colleague, her name is Becca, and she's been researching the academy for years, and if you ask her nicely, maybe she'll work with you. So, Becca, you want to?
This one. So for me, I was, my great-grandfather, Moroni MacArthur, grew up in St. George, and I found his mission journal. And so I started reading his mission journal, and it talks about, he rode a horse up to Provo from St. George, and I'm like, what's he doing in Provo? And then he talks about, taking some classes and going to dances and doing some things, and I tried to figure out why was he in Provo on his way to a mission. And it turned out that there was a missionary course that was offered at the academies for some of the more farm people who hadn't had as much education before they went on their missions. And so that's where I became aware of the academies, is through finding out that they had a missionary course. It was like a very, very early MTC experience.
I'll give a quick question here for you.
Sure.
Professor Mike Branchley here. Was there any kind of competition? This may be maybe more for Rebecca, but although Dr. Austin, you may also know this, but was there competition when the church started realizing they didn't have the funds to keep putting into these schools? Was there any kind of cutthroat competition between the areas and who's going to get the money from the church to keep going?
So, you mean competition among the academies?
And even like maybe even appealing to the church, heavy appeals to keep the money going, and was
Yeah.
somewhat competitive among the different schools.
Well, there was a funding formula, and there were always scarce resources. A whole lot of the academy funding came from the community, though. The buildings and a lot of the salaries. The church was supplemental, but really the stakes were responsible for their academies, and a lot of that fundraising and coming up with the money occurred at the stake level, and the stake president had to sort through it. So this wasn't like BYU now, where 75% of the funding comes straight from the church office building. So Becca, you wanna?
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate. There are definitely different, widely different amounts of funding coming from the church. I haven't actually looked into what that equates to. It sounds like there was a formula, but yeah, it was mostly dependent on how affluent your town was.
I'll ask the last question, I guess. The timeline of these events that you're looking at coincide very much with an important time of transition within the LDS Church.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any direct connections that you have found between what is going on nationally, right, with the ending of polygamy and the church and the LDS Church trying to be more involved in I don't know, the national conversation about education that you've noticed in the research that you've done?
So if you're familiar with Thomas Simpson's book on Mormonism in the academy or in the universities, this is a time when the church was sending out a lot of people to Eastern universities to get doctoral degrees. This is when John Widsoe and James Talmage and a number of people who became general authorities went and got qualified. This is when Alice Louise Reynolds went to Columbia. This is when you had a whole lot of people coming back with advanced degrees. When people go out to Columbia and the University of Chicago and Harvard and the University of Michigan and come back with PhDs in English, they want to do something. And so I think that it was a lot of these curricular changes were driven partly because the church felt the need to engage more, but even more because there were all of a sudden, there were a handful of Latter-day Saints with advanced degrees from very good universities who said, we can do this. We can do this and it'll be good.
Just turned it off instead of on. All right, well, thanks, everybody. I know that our speakers will be here. They'd be happy, I'm sure, to field a couple personal questions afterwards. But let's give them both a round of applause, and thank you for coming.